Next, we're going to take a look at the 31st President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt. The five criteria we use as guideposts are growth, finances, international politics, war and security, and the most important one, did they leave the country better or worse? Roosevelt made me realize that as I'm doing this assessment, that I've been giving a lot of bonuses to presidents who inherit absolute messes and are able to recover from them. And I think as I'm thinking through Roosevelt, I was also thinking about some of the other presidents. So you'll notice in the final tally at the ratings, there have been people who moved around. No one moved huge amounts, but I did reassess some rankings. A lot of the behind the scenes stuff is as much about rankings as far as how they were relative to other presidents as it is any individual scores I give. So I usually kind of go 5 as a baseline of an average presidency, and then I kind of look at a president as do they do better or worse than if no one had done anything at all, and kind of in a weird kind of way in my head. And with Roosevelt, he strikes me immediately because he inherited such a mess from Hoover, and he did things that fixed the mess. I think the bank relief that he put forward, in fact, just in most of his first 100 days, from Glass-Steagall to the bank holiday, where he was able to get things set up like the FDIC, um, the Securities and Exchange to deal with market manipulation, ending prohibition. I think he did a lot of great things during that time, and then also creating Social Security. A lot of the things he did to stabilize the subsidies market with regards to farming. Later, doing the Tennessee Valley Authority funding to create electricity. These are all great, huge things that he did that I want to give him full credit for. But in that same New Deal, you also have redlining, and you have a lot of programs that weren't so great or efficient. And I think on the whole, I'm going to give him a very high score for growth because I think he did grow the economy greatly. I think these things that he put in place, particularly with regards to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the FDIC, are things that are amazing and helpful. We can argue back and forth about the farm subsidies, whether they go too far or not enough. But given we were coming out of a huge depression where we had not addressed these needs, and the needs not being met caused a huge economic downturn and just overall bad things to happen to America, putting these things in place was positive. But I also, again, look at it as someone who did some overreach. The fact that he bucked the trend to go for a third term and then a fourth term. Um, I think that there is some truth to the critics who say he was kind of similar to Wilson, overreaching with government power and doing things that went a bit too far. I don't think that that's an incorrect assessment. I do think most of it worked, so I'm going to give him an overall positive score. But I do think that his willingness to cater to the South, his refusal to address the anti-lynching laws because he needed to keep the solid South voting bloc, and him giving them things like redlining, I think that's got to be considered when you're assessing him overall. And I think we'll discuss that more when we get to better or worse. But I think you have to give him credit for all of the things that he did. But I think sometimes he's given too much credit because the recovery was from the Great Depression to where he improved to. And he had a recession during his time, perhaps because he didn't quite balance it. But it was such a difficult thing to balance. I'm not going to criticize him. He did accomplish a huge number of things. I just think we shouldn't oversell him as a figure who would reach the levels of like a Washington or a Lincoln. I don't think he's quite that tier, and I think some people talked about him in that tier and talk about the New Deal as this flawless thing. I think we have to have honest conversations about the many flaws of the New Deal while also acknowledging on the whole it was great, did wonderful things, created bases of systems that exist to this day because they were successful and positive. Similarly, going on to finances, I would say similarly, the bank regulation, the FDIC, all of the things I spoke about in terms of growth, I think also apply to finances. But the hesitancy I would give is that he did have the recession in the middle of the recovery because he was kind of drifting away from, I would say, Keynesian approaches to a little more controlling approaches that I think were not ideal. But again, it's almost nitpicking. It was so bad before, but again, this is why I had to rethink later, and you'll see some of the rankings changed because I think given how bad it was, I think he was given a little too much credit, but he certainly deserves a lot of credit. In terms of international politics, it's a little bit more of a mixed bag. I do think the good neighbor policy was a vast improvement over what came before. But I also have to look at internment camps, like, and I guess maybe you put that more into war and security, and the fact that we didn't prevent World War II. Now, maybe we had no ability to prevent World War II. Maybe it was unrealistic and unreasonable for me to ask the question of why we didn't allow more refugees from Jewish refugees to come to the country when we saw what was happening overseas. Maybe Roosevelt politically couldn't do it when you have the fact that you have, I think it was the Bund March at the Bund event at Madison Square Garden, where we had our own American fascist state. And maybe he was politically realizing that he didn't have as much leverage. Maybe I'm second guessing him unfairly. So I am going to give him a better than average rating in terms of international politics. But I am going to say, when you took office, it was around the same time as Hitler. And then Hitler rose to power, started World War II. And we got into it, and we eventually won the war. And again, positive on that. But is there anything we could have done to not appease Hitler? Again, I think that falls more on the European powers, but it's something that I'm going to question. It's something I think we have to have as part of the discussion. Maybe there's nothing that could have been done. Maybe it was beyond all our capacity and power. Maybe it was just an impossible task that I'm asking of him. But if I'm going to question a lot of like Grant and Rutherford B. Hayes and some of the Reconstruction era people for not being able to stop Reconstruction, I also have to have the same, to be fair, question for Roosevelt as to not stopping World War II. Again, might be an impossible task. Still going to give him a very good rating in terms of international politics, but I don't think we should ignore that did happen during his watch. Again, that kind of all falls, everything we're discussing kind of falls on war and security. We did win the war. I also think people forget that Roosevelt wasn't part of the post-war recovery and stabilization. That more falls to Truman. Roosevelt died before the end of World War II, at least as far as with regards to the Pacific. And so I think people sometimes think of Roosevelt in terms of, yes, and then we created this, stable post-war world, and that wasn't Roosevelt. That was more Truman, with many flaws in that, which we'll discuss with Truman. But I do think sometimes Roosevelt gets credit for things that he didn't do, and I also think Roosevelt gets excessive credit because things were so bad before he got there. All of this to say, though, I do think Roosevelt had an incredibly good presidency, particularly relative to other presidents. I think in terms of better or worse, you can't argue that the country was significantly better after he left. But this is where I was thinking about the better or worse scale, and I kind of went back and I was looking at the chart. And so, again, inside baseball, every time I do a new president, I put the president's scores in each of these 5 categories, and then I sort them against the other presidents, and I kind of look at each president and go, okay, is he better or worse than this person? And they kind of end up in a ranking. And based on that ranking, then all the scores come together, we figure out sums, and I kind of assess, okay, this is where this president ranks. So each of the 5 criteria is rated individually, and the better or worse one it gets an extra weight. Because I do think leaving the country better or worse than you found it is the most important thing. But is it fair to presidents who inherited a fairly good presidency and continued to improve to not get good scores in better or worse because they just kind of kept the country the way it was, versus people who inherited absolute messes and were able to bring recovery out of it? I do think you should get a bonus to saving a country from chaos. And I don't think it's incorrect to have the people we have generally at the top, the Lincolns and the Washingtons, be people who were given messes and left stability. I don't know where I put Roosevelt in terms of that. I think Roosevelt left the country much better than he found it. I think he should score very high in terms of better or worse. I think he should score very high in terms of growth, because the programs he put in place were stabilizing in a way that hadn't happened for the presidents before him, going back through the Gilded Age, going back perhaps even to Lincoln. You can argue that the policies and programs he put in place, the reason that they're still here, things like Social Security, things like the FDIC, things like farm subsidies, these things are in place because they work. And things like the Tennessee Valley Authority and investment in infrastructure, the Civilian Conservation Corps in its own way. These are projects that have lasted. So he absolutely should get a lot of credit in terms of growth. But it also, I think, is shined more because we're comparing him to Hoover, who just utterly failed. So when I went back to look at the list, I knew Roosevelt was going to be very high. I knew he wasn't going to be number one or number two because I don't think he did anything on the scale of Washington or Lincoln. But I did think he was better than Teddy Roosevelt. And then I realized, did I put Teddy Roosevelt too high? And I think I did. I think I put Teddy Roosevelt too high because he was coming off of McKinley. And I was looking at McKinley basically taking the country in a hard, wrong direction, and Roosevelt going, whoa, 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 we're not going that direction. We're going to go another direction. And the direction he went was better, but it wasn't a perfect direction. It was still flawed in many ways. Comparing the Roosevelts to each other, I think is a very fair comparison. Both of them inherited mistakes coming from before them and were able to redirect the country in a better direction, but they were also flawed. Um, they were people who had significant flaws. The Roosevelts, with regards to, I think, the Panama War and the Philippines, very questionable. And, Roosevelt, with regards to redlining and internment camps, those are major strikes against them that you have to look at as part of their presidencies. Whereas I think I underrated James Monroe. James Monroe did a lot of things well. The era of good feelings is not something that happens very often. Leaving with everyone so satisfied that there's really only one party for all intents and purposes, with the exception of the Panic of 1819, he just did a good job. And so I've moved James Monroe all the way up to number 3, and now Franklin Roosevelt